Today on Swordbox Ministries.
Nothing will be impossible. I had him enrolled in his new school and he never came home. So my son had ran away from home again. My son, who had just turned 16, had been a part of 3 different street gangs and was currently running with the gang. He was driving a bullet train down the highway of hell.
Today on Swordbox Ministries, Mickey shares with us part 1 of a very powerful testimony that I'm sure you're going to want to hear.
We're beginning this week a series on teenagers, and before we start getting into the different topics we're going to talk about with teenagers, I want to give you a personal testimony about my teenager and the things that we went through in the last few years. There's a couple verses I'd like you to think about as I share with you this story. The first verse is in Luke 1:39, and it says that nothing will be impossible with God. The second verse is that it's God's goodness or kindness that leads us to repentance. That's found in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, I believe. And the third one comes from 2 Corinthians 7:10, and it says that godly sorrow produces repentance that leads to salvation. And as I think back over this testimony, I really think that's God's perspective on the things that took place. Because our perspective can be all off, but I really do believe that that's what God's perspective is on this testimony. I want to pick up in August of 2009. I had just recently went to a new church, and one of the really awesome things I found at this church was that the Sunday school classes were really big, but what they did is before class would begin, they would break into little small groups, and they would go around the circle, and each person would tell how their week was, and then if they had a prayer request, they would ask for prayer, and at the end, they would all hold hands, and we would pray together. And for me, this was a really, really awesome thing that I really needed, because I was in a position where I felt like my situation was impossible, and to the point where praying by myself wasn't enough, and I needed other people to come around me, even if it's just for once a week, hold my hand and help me lift up my concerns, primarily my concerns about my son, to Jesus Christ. I want to just give you a kind of summary of the things that have been going on over the last few years, and I'm really taking about 3 or 4 years and I'm cramming them into a few sentences, so there's no way you can really get the complete effect of what was going on. But my son, who had just turned 16, had been a part of 3 different street gangs and was currently running with a gang. He had run away from home once already. He had been charged with 3 felonies in the county that we were living in and was currently on probation for those. He had been expelled from school both his freshman year and his sophomore year for selling drugs and use of alcohol. He had a severe anger problem and a temper that would just explode. He had a growing bitterness and a hatred for God, which probably was the most hurtful thing to see in this kid. He had a lot of hurt and a lot of sorrow deep down in his heart that he didn't know what to do with. And of course, with the gang activity went the drugs and the fighting and the guns and the stealing and everything that goes with that. And he wanted nothing to do with God or church. So, for me, my situation seemed impossible. What do I do? Who do I turn to? And although we had just come off of a long summer, actually about 6 months of anger management programs, drug programs, community service, NA meetings, AA meetings, you name it, drug testing, all the stuff that goes with being in the system, it really didn't have the effect on my son that I had hoped it would, and it seemed like his anger and his bitterness was growing. A few months after I joined this new church, which I began to really depend on these prayers every week from these people, as also a few close friends who had committed to praying for my son and fasting for my son, and I have to say they stuck it out and continue to pray for my son. Awesome people. But a few months after I joined this church, things took a turn for the worse, and my son was jumped by a rival gang at school. I had to move him out of that school for his own protection, I felt, and a couple other bad things happened, and he went to school, I think the second day that I had him enrolled in his new school, and he never came home. So my son had ran away from home again, and this time, I was really frustrated. I didn't know if I'd ever see my son again. I knew that his anger and his bitter attitude towards God, along with the alcohol and the drugs, my son wasn't just running with the devil. He was driving a bullet train down the highway of hell, and he was just holding nothing back, and just you know, the only way he could cope was to push all that anger and hate off on other people, or to fill himself with drugs to numb himself. And so it was a very frustrating time, a very difficult time, but the people at church where I was going continued to pray. The leadership of the Sunday school class began to pray and began to be a great encouragement to me, knowing that they were praying for my son. And through a series of I know God-ordained steps, my son agreed to come home in January of this year and basically face the music. You know, we were certain he was going to jail for all of his violations of his probation, because his charges had been pretty serious. But they didn't. They set a court date for him. And so I began the difficult task of trying to bring my son to Christ, as I had always done before, and try to counsel him and try to get him off the drugs and trying to establish some discipline back in the home, because this was a kid who had just been running wild. And my main concern was to keep my son alive and to keep him off of the hard drugs and to keep him away from the gangs. But somewhere between January and that court date we had in March 16th, my son again got off with the wrong crowd and committed another crime and ended up in juvenile detention in another county. So unfortunately, you know, it was another blow. It was another defeat, if you want to put it. But God was still working on my son, and I began to see some godly sorrow in my son for the first time. And he began to tell me that, you know, he no longer hated God like he did before he ran away. So even though things were still happening that weren't really good, there were some things happening in my son's heart. And this video is getting kind of long, so I'm going to pick up there and finish this testimony tomorrow. And I hope you'll tune in. I hope you check out the conclusion of this testimony, because I promise you, you'll be blessed. And I promise you, it has a great ending.
Make sure you stop by Swordbox Ministries tomorrow to hear the second half of this fantastically compelling testimony from Pastor Mick.